Hi everybody, my name is Jens Larsen. In this video I'm going to go over 5 jazz blues licks. I think that the language of jazz blues, so that mix of bebop and arpeggios and chromaticism with some real nice blues sound, is something that's really interesting and also something that you definitely want to have in your playing. It's a huge part of the jazz tradition. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to go over 5 examples. They're a little bit longer than what I normally do, and that's giving me a little bit more space to use different rhythms. And I'm also going to use it as an example of how I incorporate things that are transcribed. So in these 5 examples you're going to find small phrases and bits and pieces of things that I've actually talked about in other videos as well, but also just stuff that I've checked out from solos and transcriptions. So they're gonna be phrases from George Benson, Wes Montgomery, John Scofield, Burrel and Grant Green as well. If you want to learn more about jazz guitar, improve the way that you solo, check out some interesting arpeggios or chord voicings, then subscribe to my channel. If you want to make sure not to miss anything, then click the little bell notification icon next to the subscribe button. This first example opens up with a phrase that I pretty much just copy-pasted from a Grant Green solo. So this is on a blues in G. Actually all the examples are on a blues in G, and it's just the first 4 bars of a blues in G. So 1 bar of G7, 1 bar of C7, and then back to G7, sometimes with some sort of G7 altered at the end. And the pickup here is really just a G major triad, so second inversion up to the 13th, and then via the 3rd down to the 5th again. Then we go to the C7. Here I'm using legato to create sort of a ghost note. This is really like a phrasing idea. So I'm clearly picking the A here, but the pull-off is a little bit subtle, and that's really just to create sort of a difference in the dynamics that makes the line a little bit more interesting. And then it moves back to G7. And here it's first a line that's coming out of a B diminished, so the triad that's found on the 3rd of the chord. First with a leading note, and then a scale one from the F, and then sliding into the 3rd, down to the root. And then to take us to C7, a quick augmented, G augmented triad, which is something you will find, and then going to the 9th of the C7. This is something that you'll hear a lot of people do. I know of solos from Sonny Rollins and Parker where they both do this. So, and also going to the 9th on the 4th chord. A great way to create some lines that has a jazz blues sound is of course to work with the fact that you can use the minor 3rd on a major chord. And in this case, also just to keep it a little bit more, because I think with blues you're gonna have just the basic minor 3rd on top of the major 3rd, but here when it's more jazz blues, it's a little bit more related to the chords, and you're gonna find that the minor 3rd is very often used as a leading note. And that's also what I'm doing here. I'm just sliding into it. So the upbeat is really just that flat 3rd sliding into the major 3rd on the 1. Then we get a major pentatonic phrase here. Moving to C7. Now of course the big difference between a G7 and a C7 is that B flat. That's the 7th of the C7, so that's also what gets the emphasis. So now we have... And the next part of the line is when I'm going back to G7. This is actually a quote from a George Benson solo. It's from the solo on Billy's Bounce that I have made a video on. This is off the top of my head, but I think he used it to pull the rhythm section into walking, and he plays a different rhythm. He plays all quarter notes. I'm playing it as a pickup, so I'm playing 8 notes. So these notes are just 8 notes when I'm playing it. For the rest, it's again just major pentatonic, and then also really using the leading note to the 3rd. And then from there moving on to a Parker phrase, in fact, which is also major pentatonic. So, and then the Parker phrase starts with this trill, and then ending on the flat 7, which is of course not in the major pentatonic scale, but this is very typical for Parker. You will hear him play a blues and then he won't really emphasize the flat 7 until he wants to move to the 4th degree, and that's what's happening here. Previously in this line there's no F in there, and then now we get it and it's really emphasized, and you can really hear, okay, now we're moving on to C7. Kenny Burrell is really great at using blues in his playing, and the phrase that I'm opening with here is actually also a blues phrase from him, but he's not using it on blues, it's from his solo on Bye Bye Blackbird. Essentially just major pentatonic and then using the leading note for the 3rd of the chord, so, and then we get the leading note again from the 3rd, but now an octave higher, and this nice diatonic 6 interval. And then we get another phrase that you could say that this is coming from either Wes or from George Benson. They both use this, and probably there are more people that use it, but those are the two where I came across it in solos. And that's the idea of having sort of a pedal point, a high pedal point, in this case is the root. So that's this phrase. The way they're both using it is actually where they have the 6 or the 13 in the key as a high note. I'm using the root here because I'm using on the 4th degree, and it works really well as a nice transition back to the G7. And I think that's also something that you can see in the way that I'm using these different phrases. I'm really not using them in exactly the same way as they are in the solo where I learned them. I'm really just trying to do other things with them and change stuff around and see if I can make my own little take on that little phrase. And also notice that the phrases that I'm using are really fairly short. They're usually not more than like 5 or 6 notes. So of course, well, if you count the notes with this trill, there are more notes, but essentially it's not a lot of notes. And then we get a standard double stop line which is just sort of this 3rd and then going down to the 3rd and the 5th of the chord. And then up to the 7th, so, and a pretty straightforward G7 alto line, resolving down to the 5th of C7. The reason that I can keep on publishing videos every week is that I have a community of people over on Patreon that are supporting the channel. I'm very grateful for their support, and it's because of them that I can keep on making all these jazz guitar and music theory videos. If you want to help me keep making videos, then check out my Patreon page, and if you join us over on Patreon, I can also give you something in return for your support. Another guitar player with a really strong blues influence is John Scofield. I think you can clearly hear in his playing that he's checked out, and he's also played a lot of blues. And it's really sort of the rock blues, where I think maybe you can hear also that the other guys, they're taking their blues from not only other guitar players, but also more from piano players and horn players. And here I think you can really hear with Scofield that he's also just been listening a lot to real blues guitar players and rock guitar players. The first part of this is kind of a strange line, which is also kind of fitting. It's not exactly something that I've heard Scofield do, it's just a similar idea where he's sort of spreading out an arpeggio over a few octaves and then also using different techniques to just create sort of this weirdly sounding lick that sounds really nice, but it's also quite surprising. In this case on the G7 I'm actually playing a G half diminished arpeggio, and I'm using a lot of legato to do so. So the first part is just a trill, and then just down the arpeggio, so sliding down to the next octave, and then ending on the root. So I think a lot of what is going on with a phrase like this, and this is something he does quite often in, I think maybe in that period where I know him best, which is, this is in the video where I'm analyzing a solo from the album he did with Metheny, and I think that's the period I know the best, that one with the quartet with Joe Lovano. That's kind of the same period. That's also in the late 90s, I think. And that's the records that I've checked out the most. So that's also where I hear him do stuff like this more often. So So as much as the notes is a part of this, I think the phrasing and using the legato to get different sounds out is really a huge part of what makes this work and what makes it interesting to listen to. The next part is really straightforward because it's on the C7 and it's just the triad from the third of that chord, so that's an E half diminished. And then from there, going back to the G7, we get another, this is also a quote, it starts out with a direct quote of the solo that I have in the other video, and then it moves into something else. So I'm first just playing the E and the G as a double stop here, so that phrase, and in the original this is in B flat and it's on another string set, but you can still work with it here. So, and then I play a similar phrase, but I want to make it into sort of G7 flat 9. So I'm just moving the whole thing down a whole step, and I'm also changing in rhythm because the first one is starting on the 2, and the second one is really going straight to the on the 1, and that way just changing the character of the phrase also. So it's sort of starting with a Scofield quote and then it's turning into something else. This is the second example where I'm using Wes Montgomery, and here I'm actually using again a line that's not coming from a blues originally, but it is also really using some of the melodic techniques that you'll find very often in blues, because this is a line that's pretty much just a copy paste of a line that Wes is playing on 4 and 6. So it's on the famous 4 and 6 solo from Smoking at the Half Note. He is placing it differently than what I'm doing here. I'm actually playing it, 2 beats later. And really what I'm using it for is that, of course, we get the blues phrasing in the opening statement with the G major triad. So, but the other part of this that's also really typical for blues, and which is also something that Wes uses really a lot, is this call response idea and then developing that. So first we have the, and then on the C7 we can just neatly go, and that's really just C major pentatonic on the C7, and then again, so sticking with the original call, and then the response is going, which is essentially a take on the first one, but now it's turned into a G7 altered, and then I'm adding some arpeggio. Essentially it's like an A flat minor major arpeggio, and then a scale one down to the C on the E on the C7. If you want to check out some more videos with some great phrases that you can use over a jazz blues, then check out this playlist with analysis of solos from Pat Metheny, Grant Green, John McLaughlin and John Scofield. If this is the first time you see one of my videos and you want to learn more about jazz guitar, then subscribe to my channel. If you want to help me keep making videos, then check out my Patreon page. That's about it for this time. Thank you for watching, and until next time.